I made this video to talk about why Captain Nixon in Band of Brothers knew President Roosevelt personally. I got this information neither from Ambrose's book, nor from Major Winter's books or other veterans' interviews. Actually, I found it by digging into newspaper archives. In short, the Nixons were colleagues and neighbors with Roosevelt. First, let's watch this scene from episode 9 of the show.
They're not here either.
They'll be across the river by now. Let's send out a night patrol. Check out the embankment on the far side.
President's dead.
By no means this could serve as evidence to prove Captain Nixon knew President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. However, from the newspapers, it seems that the Nixons and Roosevelt moved in the same circles as early as 1917. Theodore Roosevelt was Teddy Roosevelt, the President of America from 1901 to 1902. He was a cousin of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin's wife, Eleanor, was a niece of Teddy Roosevelt. They were all cousins, but I digress. In the Democratic National Convention of 1924, Lou's grandmother was sitting with Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt in the box of Alfred E. Smith. Alfred E. Smith was the governor of New York, and he was running for the Democratic nomination for president. Lou's grandfather was a close friend of Al Smith, and FDR was a political ally of Al Smith. That's why they were sitting together. Al Smith was a second-generation immigrant who grew up in a working-class neighborhood. His 4 grandparents were Irish, German, Italian, and Anglo-Irish. When Smith was 13, his father died. Smith had to drop out of school to help support the family. He worked at a fish market for 7 years. In his political career, he remained untarnished by corruption and worked for the passage of progressive legislation, such as an 8-hour day for women and children, for minimum wages, and for stronger workers' compensation system. Mind you, it was in the days when it's common for adults to work 100 hours a week and for children to work until they dropped. FDR started campaigning for Smith since the 1918 New York governor election. In 1921, when FDR was paralyzed by polio, many saw it as the end of his political career. But Alfred Smith took him under his wings. In 1924, Roosevelt delivered the nominating speech for Smith at the Democratic National Convention, in which he saluted Smith as a happy warrior of the political battlefield. Regarding the story between FDR and Alfred Smith, I highly recommend this book by Terry Golway. This is a video of 1924 Democratic National Convention. You can see Roosevelt on the left, standing with the help of crutches. On the right was Alfred Smith. Unfortunately, you can't see Louis Nixon's grandparents in this video, but going by newspapers, they were at the scene somewhere. In the United States presidential election of 1928, Al Smith was defeated by Hoover in a landslide, largely due to the widespread anti-Catholic sentiment against Smith. Louis Nixon's grandfather was a lifetime friend of Alfred Smith. He was appointed by Smith as a public service commissioner. Lou's grandmother was appointed as the chairman of Women's Campaign Committee of Greater New York. From the social notes of newspapers, you can see Alfred Smith's family frequently dined and entertained with the Nixons. Sometimes he would spend the weekend at the Nixon's house on Monmouth Beach, New Jersey, swimming and playing golf.
With our best girl and have a whirl on the sidewalk.
In 1928, both Nixons and the Roosevelts were invited to Smith's daughter's wedding. Because of their friendship with Smith, Nixons were also socializing with Roosevelts. For example, in this news clipping, Lou's grandmother hosted a dinner dance in the honor of Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1932, Alfred Smith ran an unsuccessful campaign for the party's presidential nomination. He ultimately lost to FDR, who would go on to win the general election. This caused rift between mentor and protege. Clearly, the Nixons sided with Smith. In 1935, when Alfred Smith visited Nixon nitration works, Lou's grandfather was still saying that Alfred Smith would be a better president than Roosevelt. Lou's grandfather died in 1940. At the funeral, Alfred Smith was his pallbearer. Apart from being colleagues in the Democratic Party, the Nixons and Roosevelts were immediate neighbors in Upper East Side Manhattan. In 1919, Lou's father, Stanhope Nixon, purchased a townhouse at 46 East 65th Street. This was a 6-story townhouse with cellar and elevator. Incidentally, Lou's father bought it from Warren Dinalo, who was FDR's uncle, his mother's elder brother. The Roosevelts lived at a double townhouse located at 47 to 49 East 65th Street. They had a large household. FDR's mother Sarah, the couple, and their 5 children all lived under the same roof. As you can see here, the Roosevelts and Nixons were opposite-door neighbors. The Roosevelt house is open to public. The interior of Nixon's house can be found in real estate advertisement, but the decoration may have been changed over the years. Both Nixons and Roosevelt owned many properties. You may have the doubt that they didn't necessarily live at the same location during the same time period. I have checked it up. Louis Nixon lived at 46 East 65th Street from infancy to at least 8-year-old. After that, he moved to another townhouse facing the Metropolitan Museum of Art, whereas the Roosevelts lived at 47 to 49 East 65th Street from 1908 until he moved to the White House. The Roosevelts had a mansion at Hyde Park, but FDR mainly stayed in town after he was wheelchair-bound, for the convenience of working from home. Therefore, they definitely lived as neighbors from 1919 to 1926. I can imagine Lou opening his window and seeing that across the street, FDR was working in his study. In October 1929, the stock market crashed, which marked the start of the Great Depression. Alfred Smith's sons had borrowed money from a bank owned by his old and dear friend James Riordan, and they used the funds to play the stock market. When the market collapsed, Smith's sons lost nearly everything they had. The bank was ruined, and Riordan killed himself. Smith was in tears at the funeral of his friend. Due to his financial distress, Smith found a new job as the head of the Empire State Building's management company. He supervised the construction of the Empire State Building. It only took a little more than a year from start to finish. The speed is unthinkable nowadays. However, the Great Depression brought the need for new office space to a grinding halt. 75% of the office space was empty. Smith and Roosevelt enjoyed the view from the 86th floor. There was nothing below them. Much of Smith's time was spent showing celebrities the view from the top of the building, in hopes of drawing attention to the enterprise and perhaps enticing talents. Lou's mother, Doris Ryer Nixon, also had work relationships with Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt. She was a national vice president of the American Women's Voluntary Service during the war. In the correspondence between AWVS and the White House, Mrs. Roosevelt invited her for luncheon, but she stood up the First Lady. This piece of news was interesting. It was merely 2 days before D-Day. Lou's mother was attending a meeting with the First Lady, discussing the post-war plans of the organization. It was very optimistic of her to focus on post-war plans when her son was nervously waiting to jump behind the German line in an operation with an estimated casualty rate of 70%. By the way, the Ryers also have their governor friend. Doris' father died when she was a child. So at her wedding to Stanhope Nixon, she was given away by the incumbent governor of New York, Charles S. Whitman, the predecessor of Alfred Smith. The mayor of New York City was also Nixon's friend. When Lou was 7 years old, his grandfather took him to participate in a model yacht regatta at Conservatory Lake in Central Park. Lou won the third place, and Grandpa browbeat him to name his boat Mayor Walker. That's Jimmy Walker, the handsome, flamboyant, and corrupt mayor of New York City, Bo James. I bet little Lou was so fed up with politics. Jimmy Walker was also a political protege of Alfred Smith. Years later, Smith pressured Jimmy Walker to resign in order to protect FDR's good name. Alfred Smith and FDR finally reconciled during the World War II. Smith was an early and vocal critic of the Nazi regime in Germany, as early as 1933. Back then, many still saw Hitler as a charismatic, strong man. Smith enthusiastically supported American military involvement in World War II. Although he was not asked by Roosevelt to play any role in war effort, he was an active and vocal proponent of FDR's attempt to amend the Neutrality Act in order to sell war equipment to the Britain. There is another Easter egg I want to show you. In episode 7, Dick Winters quipped with Louis Nixon about Norman Dyke.
You know what Dyke's problem is, don't you? He's just another one of those arrogant rich jerks from Yale.
Oh, God, not another one of those.
It turns out that Nixon's really knew Dykes. Lou's grandfather went to many social events with Dyke's father, also his namesake. Dyke's father was of the same age of Lou's grandfather. He was a New York State Supreme Court judge from 1920 to 1932. He married late, so he was 56 when Dyke was born. Norman Dyke was his only child. Another Easter egg. Lou's grandmother was at the christening of Gloria Vanderbilt. That was Anderson Cooper's mother. At last, let's go back to watch this scene from episode 7.
Captain Nixon, sir? Captain Nixon, sir.
What?
Good morning, sir. Sorry to disturb you. This came from Division.
All right. Morning.
Lou, eviction notice?
Not quite, but I think I got something that'll help you with your leadership problem.
Huh, Dyke's being transferred?
No, I can't help you with that. But Division has decided to pluck one officer from each regiment that served in the heroic defense of Bastogne, send him back to the States on a 30-day furlough, get him out banging the drum for the war bond drive, that kind of thing. Turns out I've been plucked.
Hey, that's fantastic, Lou. Good for you.
Thank you.
How in the world does your leaving help me?
Doesn't, I'm not going. I've already seen the States. I grew up there, that's why I came to Europe. I just wish they told me there was a war on. Anyway, the point is, this thing's wasted on me. But I'm sure we can find an officer somewhere in this battalion who could use a long trip home.
Now, come to think about it, I suspect that Captain Nixon didn't win the lottery purely by good luck. Maybe his family saw the high casualty of the Battle of the Bulge. They can't risk losing their only heir, so they pulled some strings. But it's all my speculations, and he gives the opportunity to Lieutenant Peacock anyway. After all, if he didn't want to fight, his family has the connections to prevent him being drafted. If he didn't fancy being a 4F, he could get a desk job at the headquarters. For Louis Nixon, there were numerous ways to avoid seeing combat, but he volunteered to join the paratroop. Not just that, he enlisted very early, 1 year before the Pearl Harbor attack. Back then, the isolationist sentiment was still the mainstream public view. A Harvard Student Union survey published in November 1939 indicated that 95% of the students were against immediate American entry into the war, while 78% wanted America to refrain from entering the war, even if France and England were both defeated. The motives of Louis Nixon joining the army remains a mystery.